I had just walked out of my mother's hospital room, still holding the discharge papers the nurse handed me, when I overheard my brother and his wife talking in the hallway around the corner. They didn't know I was there. They thought I was still inside saying goodbye. What they said made me grip those papers so hard the edges cut into my palm. My name is Megan. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a licensed CPA working in corporate tax at a mid-size firm in Atlanta. I'm not wealthy. I drive a used Honda and I bring my lunch to work 4 days a week. But 18 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, and my grandmother, her mother, passed away 3 weeks after the diagnosis, leaving behind a carefully maintained estate that none of us knew the full size of until the week she died. Grandma had lived quietly in the same house in Savannah for 42 years. She wore the same brand of orthopedic shoes. She clipped coupons out of the Sunday paper until she was 83. She drove a Buick she'd owned since 2004, and she never, not once, talked about money. So when her estate attorney called our family and said that her total assets, including a paid-off commercial property on Broughton Street and a significant investment portfolio she'd been quietly growing since the 1980s, came to just over $4 million, my brother Darren didn't hear $4 million. He heard his name on a check. The day I overheard them in that hospital hallway, my mother had just been admitted for a bad fall. It was a Tuesday. I had driven 3 hours from Atlanta to get there, taken time off work without notice, and sat with her through 6 hours of tests and imaging. My brother had shown up at hour 4 with his wife Tamsin and a Starbucks he didn't offer to share. I was coming back from returning the wheelchair to the nurse's station when I heard Tamsin's voice, low and careful the way people talk when they think walls have ears, but not quite enough to actually whisper. She's going to have to move into memory care within the year. You know that, right? I stopped walking. I know, my brother said, which is why we need to get the POA locked in before she has another bad episode. Once a judge decides she's incapacitated, it gets complicated. Your sister is going to fight it. Megan doesn't even live here. She doesn't know what mom's been like day to day. I'll tell her the POA is just to help manage bills while mom recovers. She'll sign off. And the estate distribution? Your grandmother's trust? There was a pause. I heard him exhale. Grandma's attorney is retiring in the spring. If we move the trust administration to my guy before then, we can restructure how the assets are categorized. Mom's share becomes part of her care fund, technically controlled by whoever holds the medical POA. I stood completely still in that hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. A nurse pushed a cart past me and I didn't move an inch. I was doing math in my head. I do that when I'm scared. I count and calculate because it's the only thing that makes me feel like the ground is still under my feet. He wasn't talking about taking care of our mother. He was talking about taking control of $4 million while our mother lost her ability to understand what was happening to her. I walked back around the corner, pushed open the door to my mother's room, and sat down in the chair next to her bed. She was half asleep, the TV on low. I held her hand and I did not let myself cry. I just listened to her breathe and thought about every single step I was going to take next. I want to be fair here, because fair is something I owe myself even when no one else is offering it. My brother Darren is not a monster in the way that word usually gets used. He's charming. He coaches his son's little league team. He sends birthday cards, sometimes even on time. But Darren has also been quietly drowning in debt for the better part of 5 years, and the people closest to him either don't know it or have decided not to see it. His landscaping business looked successful from the outside. The truck decals, the crew, the logo on his polo shirts. But I'd run the numbers once when he asked me to help him with a loan application 2 years ago. And what I found was a business with a 40% profit margin that was somehow always 2 payroll cycles away from collapse. He had a habit of financing things that should have been expense. Equipment leases, vendor credit lines, a commercial truck loan that was costing him twice what the truck was worth. And Tamsin had taste. Beautiful house, beautiful kitchen, kids in private school. Something had to give eventually. I just didn't expect that something to be my mother. I drove back to Atlanta that night. I didn't say much to Darren when I left. I hugged my mother, told her I'd be back Friday, and walked past my brother in the hallway with nothing more than a drive safe that I said to the air between us. The moment I got home, I opened my laptop and pulled up every document I had access to from Grandma's estate. As the co-executor named in her original will, something Darren had apparently forgotten or was betting I'd never act on, I had standing to request a full accounting from her attorney. I emailed him that night. By Thursday morning, I had a phone call scheduled. What the attorney told me confirmed what I'd already suspected. Grandma had been meticulous. Her trust was structured specifically to protect my mother's share from being absorbed into a general estate fund. The $4 million was split, a portion designated for my mother's care with very specific language about how it could and could not be used, a portion to be divided between Darren and me, and a small legacy gift to her church in Savannah. The trust had protections built into it that Darren's plan would require dismantling. Not impossible to do, but it would require either my mother's fully informed consent or a court-appointed guardian, and it would leave a paper trail clear enough to read from space. I didn't tell Darren any of this. I let him believe I was still in the dark. The following week, he called me. His voice was warm and careful, the voice he uses when he wants something. "Hey, I've been thinking about Mom. She needs more support than either of us can give her right now, and I want to make sure her finances are set up in a way that protects her. I talked to a guy, an estate planner my buddy uses, and he thinks we should consolidate the trust administration so things are easier to manage." "That makes sense," I said. "I'd want to review whatever documents he puts together before anything gets signed." "Of course," he said immediately. Too immediately. "Obviously. I'll send everything over." He sent me a package 3 days later. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and went through it page by page. What he was proposing was technically legal in the way that a lot of things that shouldn't be legal technically are. The consolidation would appoint him as sole trustee, removing me as co-executor. It would reclassify my mother's designated care funds as a discretionary account, meaning Darren would have unchecked authority over how the money was spent. The estate planner he'd hired had been creative with the language. If I hadn't spent the last 8 years reading documents exactly like this for a living, I might have missed what it actually meant. I called Grandma's attorney back. "This is a problem," he said quietly after I walked him through the proposal. "I know," I said. "What do I need to do?" "Right now, the most important thing is your mother's capacity. If she's still legally competent, and based on what you're describing, she likely is, she can reaffirm the original trust terms in writing and designate her own healthcare proxy. That locks things in before anyone else can move. Can we do that without Darren knowing?" There was a pause. "There's nothing that requires you to notify him. She's the principal. It's her estate." I drove back to Savannah that weekend. I told my mother everything. That was the hardest part. Not the legal maneuvering, not the paperwork, not even sitting across from my brother later and watching him lie to my face. The hardest part was sitting in my mother's living room, the afternoon light coming in through the curtains she'd had since I was in middle school, and telling her that her son had been in that hospital hallway, talking about her money while she was still in the bed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I always thought if things got hard, he'd be the one who stepped up." "I know," I said. "I think I just wanted that to be true." We met with Grandma's attorney the next morning. My mother, in front of a notary, reaffirmed the original trust terms in full. She designated me as her sole healthcare proxy and her financial power of attorney in the event of incapacity. She was sharp that day. Present. She remembered the name of my third-grade teacher and the year Grandma bought the Broughton Street property. The notary had no concerns. The documents were filed by end of business. I drove home to Atlanta and waited. It took Darren 11 days to figure out that something had changed. His estate planner must have done a routine check with the county and found the updated filings, because Darren called me on a Wednesday evening and his voice had lost all of its warmth. "Did you go see an attorney?" "I went to see Mom," I said. "And yes, we met with Grandma's attorney while I was there. Mom wanted to review her documents. Without telling me?" "She's the principal, Darren. She doesn't need your permission." The silence on the line had a texture to it. I could feel him recalculating. "I think you're making this harder than it needs to be," he said finally. "I'm trying to help our mother." "I know you think that," I said, and I hung up. Over the next 2 weeks, Darren tried 3 different approaches. The first was guilt, a long text message about how much he'd sacrificed, how often he'd been the one to show up, how I'd been 4 hours away while he handled everything. Some of that was true and it landed. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But sacrifice doesn't give you the right to control someone else's assets without their understanding. I knew the difference even when it hurt. The second approach was Tamsin. She called me, which she almost never does, and her voice was soft and careful in a way that made my skin prickle. She said she was worried about family unity. She said she hoped this wouldn't become a legal thing. She said she and Darren just wanted what was best for everyone, and that maybe we could all sit down and talk through what a fair arrangement might look like. I'm open to that, I told her. Have your attorney contact Grandma's attorney and we can schedule a formal meeting. That was not what she meant, and she knew I knew it. The third approach was their kids. Darren brought his children to visit my mother without telling me, and then posted photos on Facebook with a caption about family and love that I'm certain was meant for an audience that included our extended relatives. I saw the comments. Our aunt wrote, "Love you both so much, Darren. You're such a good son." An older cousin wrote, "Family first." Nobody asked how my mother was doing. They just performed emotion in a comment section and called it care. I did not respond publicly. I did not explain myself to our relatives. I did not start a counter-campaign or call our aunt to give my version of events. I just let it sit there and kept my focus on what actually mattered. Because here's what I had that Darren didn't: receipts. When I'd reviewed his estate consolidation proposal, I noticed that his personal estate planner, the guy his buddy uses, had a disciplinary note on his state license from 2019 related to misrepresentation of fiduciary duties. I filed that away. I also ran a UCC lien search on Darren's landscaping business, the kind of thing I do as a reflex because I'm an accountant and old habits die hard. What I found was a string of unpaid vendor claims going back 14 months, totaling a little over $60,000. Two of his equipment lenders had already initiated collection proceedings. His business was not 2 payroll cycles from collapse. It was closer to 1. I forwarded everything to Grandma's attorney and asked him a simple question. Given what I'd found about Darren's financial situation, what would happen if he successfully obtained control of my mother's care funds? Best case, the attorney said, he acts in good faith and manages them responsibly, despite his personal instability. Worst case, they get entangled in his business creditors' claims and your mother ends up with nothing for her actual care. And the Broughton Street property? I asked. Is it generating income? It is. There's a commercial tenant on a 5-year lease. The rental income goes directly into the trust each month. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I asked him to pull the full lease agreement and tell me the name of the tenant. He told me. It was a residential staging company, the kind that furnishes model homes and luxury listings for real estate sales. I looked them up. Their website listed their primary service area. It listed their main clients, and on the About Us page listed as a founding business partner was Tamsin. I read that 3 times. Tamsin's staging company was operating out of a commercial property that belonged to my grandmother's trust. A trust my brother was trying to take control of. The monthly rent she was paying, below market rate. I later confirmed, about 40% under what comparable units on Broughton Street were running, was going into the estate she and my brother were maneuvering to control. They hadn't just been trying to protect themselves from financial disaster. They had already been benefiting from my grandmother's estate in a way that was never disclosed to anyone, including, I suspect, to my grandmother herself. I called Grandma's attorney back within the hour. Was this lease arrangement disclosed during the estate settlement process? A long pause. I don't believe it was. Is that a problem? Potentially a significant one, he said carefully. If a beneficiary held a below-market tenancy in estate property without disclosure to the co-executor or the principal, that could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, depending on how the trust documents are written. How are they written? I'm going to need to look at this more carefully. He called me back the next morning. The trust documents Grandma had signed, with her usual meticulousness, included a clause requiring full disclosure of any financial relationship between a trust beneficiary and trust assets. The below-market lease had never been disclosed. It had been active for 2 years, predating Grandma's death, meaning Tamsin had been renting that property at a discount while Grandma was still alive. And no one had told her attorney, no one had told me, and based on the look of the paperwork, no one had told Grandma either, not clearly. I didn't call Darren. I didn't tip off Tamsin. I asked the attorney to formally document the finding and prepare a demand letter requiring disclosure and retroactive adjustment of the below-market rent differential going back to the start of the lease. I also asked him to send that letter directly to Darren and Tamsin via certified mail, return receipt requested. Then I went to visit my mother. She was having a good week. We sat on her back porch and drank sweet tea, and she told me a story about Grandma I'd never heard before. About the year she'd saved enough money waiting tables to buy her first savings bond. She'd done it quietly, without telling anyone, because she wanted to know she could before she let herself feel proud of it. I thought about that the whole drive back. The certified letters arrived at Darren's house on a Thursday. I know because the return receipt came back to me on a Friday. By Friday afternoon, my phone was ringing. I let it go to voicemail. His message was long. Parts of it were angry. Parts of it sounded like the Darren I grew up with, the one who used to make me laugh until I cried at the Thanksgiving table, and those parts were the hardest to hear. He said I was blowing up the family. He said I was doing this to punish him. He said Grandma would be heartbroken. I sat with that voicemail for a while. I even started to type out a response twice and deleted it both times. Then I thought about my mother in that hospital bed. I thought about her saying she'd always thought Darren would be the one who stepped up. And I thought about the fact that Tamsin's staging company had been paying 40% below market rent on property that belonged to my mother's future care fund, and that no one had told my grandmother, and that Darren had stood in a hospital hallway 4 days after my mother's fall and talked about restructuring a trust so he could control it. I didn't send a response. I called Grandma's attorney instead and told him to proceed. The formal trust review process took about 6 weeks. What it turned up, once a forensic accountant, not me, someone independent, went through the full records, was messy in the way that things are messy when someone has been cutting corners for years and assuming no one was paying close enough attention. The below-market lease was the centerpiece, but there were also 2 instances where Darren, in his informal role helping Grandma manage some of her accounts before she died, had transferred funds in ways that weren't clearly documented. Nothing that rose to the level of criminal theft, but enough that the independent accountant flagged them, enough that the attorney took them seriously, and enough that when Darren sat down across from Grandma's attorney and 2 independent trustees that the court had appointed to oversee the review, he did not look like the competent, caring son he'd been presenting himself as. He looked like a man who'd gotten used to operating in the margins and assumed the margins would always protect him. The outcome wasn't dramatic in the way courtroom things sometimes are. There was no arrest, no public confrontation. What there was, Darren agreed, through his own attorney, a different one than the estate planner, to repay the differential on the below-market lease, going back 26 months. The 2 undocumented transfers were reviewed and 2/3 of the amount was returned to the trust. He was formally removed as a potential trustee candidate. The court appointed a professional fiduciary to oversee my mother's care fund going forward, independent of both of us. I was named the designated healthcare proxy, which I already was, but now it was court-confirmed. Darren did not come to my mother's birthday dinner in November. He sent a card. Tamsin's company quietly vacated the Broughton Street property at the end of their lease period and did not renew. My mother moved into a memory care facility in January, a good one, the kind with a garden and a music program on Thursday afternoons. Her care is fully funded. The trust is intact. She has her own room with a window that gets afternoon light, and she has a little shelf where she keeps a photo of Grandma next to a photo of the 2 of us from a beach trip we took when I was maybe 7. I visit twice a month. Sometimes she knows exactly who I am, and we talk for 2 hours. Sometimes she's somewhere else, somewhere further away, and I just sit with her and hold her hand and watch whatever she has on TV. It's not the outcome I wanted. I wanted my brother to be the person I used to think he was. I wanted to be wrong about what I heard in that hallway. I wanted my grandmother's estate to be a gift that brought us together, instead of a thing that finally made visible what had already been broken. But I've stopped spending energy trying to make the truth into something easier. What happened happened. What I did because it was right, and because my mother deserved someone who would fight for her without needing anything in return. I read something once that my grandmother had written in the margin of an old financial journal she kept. Just a penciled note, in her small, careful handwriting. It said, "Quiet and correct will outlast loud and wrong every single time." She was right. She usually was. If you've ever had to be the one who stays quiet and does the work while everyone around you does the talking, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this one meant something to you, please subscribe. We share stories like this every week. Stories about real people choosing integrity when it costs them something, because those are the stories worth telling.